The Greek Revolution, economic collapse, political dictatorship, and unemployment were crucial factors in immigration in the years between 1821 and 1836. Census statistics show waves of Greeks immigrating to Canada over the past century. In 1871, 39 immigrants came and settled in urban centers of Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. By 1901, 213 Greeks were landed, and their numbers grew to 2,640 by 1911. After having established themselves in their new country, they were able to sponsor and financially assist other families to immigrate to North America. Canada saw Greek communities grow in rural areas like Owen Sound. Family was the foundation of the social structure and providing emotional and financial support to its members. Families came from their homeland towns and villages of Sparti, Peloponnesa, and Anoia in the region of Laconia. Each new family immigrating to Owen Sound was connected either through marriages or close association to Christos Georgios and his wife Sadie Skopas before 1920. An average of 54 Greeks were living in Owen Sound over the next 25 years. Businesses, particularly restaurants, were established and families worked in their operation. They eventually became successful businessmen in restaurants, theater operators, tobacconists, recreation developers, bowling alley and billiard academy operators, investors of commercial real estate, and even represented municipal and federal politics. Canadians of Greek origin continue to remain proud of their heritage and work hard at keeping their culture alive. My name is Liliane Georgios Holding. I'm a second-generation Greek in Owen Sound, Ontario, and I'm a very proud descendant of my grandparents, Sadie and Chris Georgios. My grandfather was the third oldest of 12 children in a little village called Agalona in Greece. It's down on the Peloponnesus Peninsula, and it overlooked the Aegean Sea. And my great-grandfather was the priest, or the priest of the village. And my grandfather, Christos, was actually slotted to become the next priest of the village, and that's where he was focused. But as things happened, times were tough, and when you have a lot of children to feed, and when a letter comes from Canada from a cousin, also noted as uncle for respect, he owned a green grocery in Sault Ste. Marie, and he wrote to my great-grandfather, Aria Georgios, and asked if he could send one of his sons to Canada. Then money came, $85 came to Agalona, and my great-grandfather said, okay, Christos, you are going. So he was put on a train, and he got to Patras. In Patras, he boarded a ship, and he sailed to Ellis Island. And then he was conned, and his money was stolen. And so he was actually penniless and only had the clothes on his back. But somebody helped him, got him onto that ship, and he ended up in Ellis Island, and then took a train up to Sault Ste. Marie to work for his uncle as a greengrocer.
My father came over in 1951. He left Greece about a week before he was to be drafted into the army. This would have been about 2 years after the Civil War. And so he came here. His sister, Betty Lagogenis, sponsored him. And he came over here, just like anyone else, for a better life. He came over with one suitcase and $5 in his pocket. But he did come over to work in a restaurant, one of his, a Georgian restaurant, one of the other Greeks that had immigrated to Owen Sound. And after that, he went to work at the woodworking factory, the RCA. And he worked there for a few years, and then he opened a restaurant called the Trio Restaurant in 1959. He worked 37 years in the restaurant business.
My name is Achilles Stavru, the one and only. I'm the only redhead Greek ever born in Owen Sound with the name Achilles. I was born in Owen Sound, proudly born in Owen Sound. And this boy has lived on both sides of the Atlantic, and I'm a very, very proud Greek Canadian. My father was a third engineer in the boats. So he traveled the world at a very, very young age, and he traveled the world and he visited many, many countries, and the money was incredible. But one of the countries that he visited and he was very impressed with was Canada. He said, if I'm gonna have a family, I have to leave the boats. So he spent in the late 50s a few years in Canada, went back to Greece to do his military service, and then officially did all his documents through the Canadian Embassy and came and landed in Canada. And he said to me last night when I was asking him, in 66 in Montreal, by plane.
I came in 1954. We left Greece October the 28th, 1954. Landed in Halifax November the 8th. Took a train to Toronto, 11th of November, Remembrance Day. Owen Sound later that day, so I came to Owen Sound on Remembrance Day, 1954. Never forget that. But I also came in shorts and sandals, and the next day, there was about 4 or 5 inches of snow. And I've never seen snow before, and I said, oh my God, where did I come to? What is this?
My grandmother was the youngest of 5 children, and at the age of 2, her father died. And that left my grandmother, Vasiliki, a widow at the age of 25, pardon me. She was 25 years old, and she had these 5 children. Things were drying up, and between the war, the men were dying, children were dying of diseases, and so her sons then chose to go to North America. So they immigrated in the late 1890s and established themselves. So they could not read or write. They had that strike against them. They had to talk with the priest of the village to read the correspondence. So they migrated in 1911, and just the 2 women. At Ellis Island, they were then given their anglicized names. So that was very confusing for them. There was a Greek translator, but they still could not understand why their names had to be anglicized. But as far as they were concerned, they were always going to be Vasiliki and Stavroula Skopakis.
My mother, a little different story. She came over in 1959, and she came over to marry my father. She had 30 days to marry him. And if she didn't marry him in 30 days, she would be deported. And my dad still talks about that every day. He says, I had 30 days to send her back, he says, but I decided to keep her. And so when my mother came over, she came, I guess you could call it, as an arranged bride, an arranged marriage. Her family, her brother is the one who made the arrangements to come to Canada and to marry my father. She knew my father from the village. My mother's village is Ayozayani, and they're only about maybe a 10-minute drive apart, but my dad's family also had a winter home right across the street from my mother's. And my dad, his original village that he came from is called Nyata, and that's how they knew each other, and that's how they arranged this marriage. So she came here, married my father, and a month later, they opened the restaurant.
So my father grew up was born in Piraeus. His parents, they were from Smyrna, from Izmir in Turkish, Smyrna in English, Smyrni in Greek. And in the early 1900s, the Turks threw them in the sea. And 1 million of them immigrated, and they ended up in Piraeus. My mother is from an hour and a half outside Athens, and as when people do ancient Greek history, there's a place called Thebes, in Greek Theva. She is very close by, a little small village called Erythres.
I come from outside Sparta. Anoia is the name of the village. At one time, we had about 600 people. Last year, when I was there's only about 325. And you know what? About 50% of them are gone to America or Australia or somewhere. There was 8 different families that migrated to Canada and eventually Owen Sound. The Tombrases, the Tatulases, of course, Menurises, and everybody else. There was 8 families, and there was 8 restaurants in Owen Sound. And guess who had them? The people from my village, all 8 of us.
My grandfather was very intelligent, and one of the first things he wanted to do was to be able to overcome the language. So he seemed to be quite a linguistic fellow, and he wrote away for a gramophone and the old wax cylinders, and he learned to speak English and French and Spanish. Anyway, he worked hard 6 days a week. Sunday was a day of rest. He was given orange crates and a pallet, and he slept under the front window of the little greengrocer's store, and so he was actually the watchdog through the evenings. He ended up saving his money. He sent money home to his family.
My dad, he picked up the language pretty quick because he was out there working at the factory, working in the restaurant. My dad also not being able to drive when he first got here. He was driving in Athens, but he couldn't drive here because he didn't have his license yet. And my mother, they had a cafe. My grandfather opened it up, and so my mom and the family ran that family cafe. And she came here, and she got in the restaurant business within a month that she was here. So she had that little bit of experience.
My parents met by a picture. My aunt showed a picture of my mom, and my father said, "Oh, very nice lady. Very nice lady." Flew to Canada, they met, and what you see in front of you is so...
My grandfather said, "Why don't you go and ask Mr. Basil's restaurant, Young and Gerard?" He says, "Why don't you go and learn the trade to cook?" So he made him a short order cook, or the start of a short order cook, because it just lasted a month. And then he decided to come to Owen Sound and visit his cousin, Mr. and Mrs. Tatulis, which had the Olympia restaurant. Well, they needed help. So they said, "Why bother going back to Toronto? Why don't you stay here with us? Get a room," which he did. Now he was in with a Greek family, well, half Greek, half Canadian. And, he felt at home in Owen Sound.
So he came across, I know he was at the top of what we call St. Mary's Cemetery Hill, 16th Street, 15th Street East in Owen Sound. And he just looked out onto that bay, and it was a Aegean blue and turquoisey green, and it just reminded him of Agalona, his hometown. So that pulled his heartstrings, and he thought, I like the water, I like the hillsides. So he then approached Main Street. He was disappointed to see that there already was a candy shop on Main Street in Owen Sound. It was operated by the Dumas brothers, their father and a cousin. And then he approached them and said, "Are you looking for a little capital?" So I'm reading a little bit into this. So he became a partner to them, but he asked if they would change the name to the Sparta Candy Kitchen. The Dumas brothers sold the business. They moved to New York City, and so Christos Georgios was the main Greek of Owen Sound. So as it was then, all the three other Georgios brothers joined my grandfather in Owen Sound, and all the other businesses that he had were closed out, and they were established in Owen Sound. We're standing at the busy intersection in downtown Owen Sound, 10th Street and 2nd Avenue East. This was the Mecca where the Greeks of Anoia all came and started their restaurants, made their livelihood here. Behind me is where the Trio restaurant was, and the Myras, Lagojanis, and Tombros families were all in partnership for the Trio and ran that for 37 years. And they all came together. They all served food, Canadianized food, with a little bit of a Greek flair to it.
Back then, it was my father and his two sisters and their partners. They all had worked in restaurants, so why not open up your own restaurant? And the food back then was, there was no Greek food. It was all the Canadian food that you don't even see on menus today.
My father opened his first pizzeria in 1977 on 9th Street across from CFOS. He brought a stone oven to Owen Sound. The rest is history. So my father comes back, he wants to open a new business, which is where we have been for 35 years, serving Owen Sound with lots of love and pride. Europa restaurant on 8th Street. And somebody said, "Gregory, there's somewhere in Owen Sound in a warehouse, there's a stone oven." My father goes and he sees this pizza oven And that's his original pizza oven from 1977. He goes, how much for the oven? 35 years later, that's the oven that we use.
We Canadianized everything, but with a Greek flavor. Louis, well, we started out as a lunch counter, and then we became Steak and Seafood House in 1975. And we bought 5 acres out in the Meaford Highway, Highway 26, and we renovated it into a Steak and Seafood House. And we had that from 1977 until 1998.
I think about all the times my grandfather marched his family up from 1091 straight up to the next block to open the theater. All of the children actually worked in the theater, and at one point in time, the Children's Aid Society came and started to condemn my grandmother for having her children and using them for child labor. In 1921, my grandfather always had a dream of opening the theaters. So he loved vaudeville, and he loved singing and music, and he just loved film. They sold the candy business. They were able to put that capital into building their classic theater. And consequently from that business supported the family for well into the 1960s. And each family member worked in there. They were ticket takers, they were candy counters, they were ushers. My grandfather actually had a pit band. So my grandfather decided he was going to have lessons done for his children. George actually had had an affinity for violin. Louis went on the trap, so that was an old leady set of drums. And my Uncle Bill got to take piano lessons, so he played what was honky-tonk music then. So the 3 Georges boys became the pit orchestra. Then something happened with the projectionist. My second oldest son, Bill, became a projectionist, and he was his number 3 licensed projectionist in all of Ontario.
My Uncle Pete would have huge pots of turkeys cooking in the back to make turkey gravy, and the roast beefs in the oven, and the pies he would make, rice puddings. People still remember that today.
Everybody in Owen Sound knows my father for all the years in the restaurant, and everybody knew him in Owen Sound with his bicycle shopping. And 9 years ago when I took over, I go, oh my God, my father used to take me shopping every day when I arrived and I have the car. I said, oh, no, when I take over the business, I'm not going shopping every day. Well, guess what? I go shopping every day.
My father-in-law was, Peter Tombras, which became my father-in-law later. We were competitors, but he came from the same town as I did. And the Miras and the Lagojanises. The Scopus was George. Originally, it started out with Scopus, which was Mrs. George's brother. Bill Scopus started that restaurant, and then his family continued later until George Papadakos and his wife bought it, which came from Manoia as well. Originally it was Riviera, and he was from Manoia, but he sold it to Steve and Ted Menudas. Ted's restaurant, Manoia there. Georgian restaurant, which was a restaurant in the 40s and 50s, was my father-in-law's, Peter Tombras. One of the partners from the trio was his uncle. So there again, he was from Manoia. Trio, as I said earlier, and then to go down further to Percy's, was a second cousin of mine, and her name was Maria Christofilakos, and that was from my grandmother's side. Christofilakos was my grandmother's maiden name. That was the only one that had any skills, to my knowledge, was my father-in-law, and he was cooking in the army the first year or two when he was in. He was helping to cook.
Like Owen Sound was, there was destination. Greek restaurants were destinations. Nobody made Greek food.
They remember their mother, their grandmother cooking, and they used those bases. And others was trial and error. And you know what? When a sandwich is worth 50 cents, it doesn't really matter, does it? Or a steak. A porterhouse steak in 1965 was $2.45, including mushrooms. Now try and get that today.
The curious thing about the Greek community of Owen Sound, they all migrated from the area of Manoia in the province of Laconia in the Peloponnesus Peninsula of Greece. They came through relationships and friendships. They started restaurants, were in competition, healthy competition, and were able to raise and support their families in the economy of Owen Sound.
My God, there was a difference, a lot of difference. I didn't know what to expect. Number one, we didn't know a word of English. I didn't know yes or no meant. We were enrolled at Dufferin School, but Dufferin School didn't, if you don't know the language, how are you going to learn it? And they put me in the, what they call opportunity class in Strathcona. And there was other kids that were behind. That's why I learned the language, like ABC and CAT, cat, DOG, dog. And I would go home and repeat all this, whatever I learned each day. That was in January. By June, I had learned enough English to go to grade 4. It was tough. It was tough in school because we were immigrant kids. It wasn't easy. There was, a few name callings and what have you. But being the Spartan that I am, I proved that I was a real true Spartan. And within a year, there was no problems. After that, don't mess with the Gaverises.
For her to leave her family of 6 siblings, come to a country, you don't know the language, you're coming to marry someone who you've not seen maybe for a few years, very difficult. Not knowing the language, to move to a different country and not know how to speak one word of that language, and to go out there and work and try and make a living, they were brave and resilient.
I went to Greece. I edged my way in on my dad's second honeymoon. He took me to the village of Peloponnea, where my grandmother was born and raised until the age of 13. And I stood at the back of her home, which was dilapidated, run down. It was ancient. But in the backyard there were lemon trees, and I could smell the leaves, and I could see the oregano growing, and could smell that on the breeze. And I just kind of got goosebumps and thought, how did my grandmother feel? And I thought, here she is, 13 years old, leaving what she knew to go to North America. And I just thought that just have been a frightening experience. She had some anguish there. And I think because it was a very small community, she was going to be missing some of the people that were in the village that she was leaving behind.
My mother found it very hard. She found it very hard because, again, she was in her early 40s, I would say, at that point. And how do you learn a new language? But fortunately, we had the Georges family, we had the Tatulas family, and they took her under their wing. And eventually, she was Canadianized. They were accepted in the community, and thank God that we were able to be part of the community. And we respected them, and eventually, that respect was returned. And I feel very grateful to be living in a city like Owen Sound. I visit Greece a lot, once a year, but I come back home. This is home too.
We are standing outside the 1091 2nd Avenue East, Owen Sound, Ontario. This was formerly known as Water Street. In 1922, Christos Georges brought Sadie, her mother Bessie Scopus, and their children, George, Bill, Louis, Connie, and Helen, to live here. The last 5 children came along later with Georgia, Jim, Frida, Earl, and Nick. This is the Georges home as it looked through the 1930s to the 1950s. As with most people, they were wanting to modernize and to also be able to compensate and close the porch in to add more living space. There's a lot of love and laughter, music, sporting feats all came out of this house, providing to the community entertainment with their music, their theater business, their athleticism, and their kindness to their community. Growing up I was baptized and christened in Greek Orthodox Church, the Anglican Church. They brought the priests up from Toronto. My grandparents' home was the christening site. Everybody would gather. There could be 6 babies baptized on that day. There was always food coming together. And just the community of family. They both always gave back to their Greek church in Toronto and supported the St. George's congregation in Owen Sound.
We had St. George's we are affiliated to, but it's not Orthodox. It's not. We would bring a priest up for christenings, for weddings from the city, but it was difficult.
My grandfather and grandmother, because of their deep religious backgrounds and their faith, they were holding Greek special occasions at their own residence. So my grandmother and grandfather would feed upwards of 60 people in their home in the dirty 30s and through that. So then it came about, they said, this isn't right, we need a church of our own. But as it turned out, it was chosen to go to Toronto. So Christos had affiliation with Nathanson. He was with the Jewish Holy Blossom Church. They were selling that. They'd outgrown their congregation space, and so they did a handshake deal. My grandfather and grandmother hopped in their car, traveled 20,000 kilometers, and raised close to $40,000 during the 1936-37 years. And they purchased the church. It was overseen by my grandfather to be converted into the Byzantine style.
Growing up here in the 70s, it's not Toronto. You don't have Greek schools on Saturday because all the Greek kids in Toronto go to Greek schools on Saturdays.
Within my house, I'm a Greek. Outside my house, I'm a Canadian. And I think most of us do that. And we're able to do that just to keep our roots, our language, and everything.
I have probably kept it more alive than my parents because my parents were too busy growing up. We do the Greek Easter and the traditions with breaking eggs.
Even now with my own grandchildren, they know it's Easter time and we're going to have a colored egg and we're going to crack eggs. And
I make a lot of Greek desserts, Greek foods.
The traditions continue because my nephew, who lives in the same home with my parents, learned from a very young age, learned the Greek language with my parents. The only bad thing is that when my nephew was 4 or 5 years old, he was speaking English with a Greek accent because of my parents. So you hear my nephew back then, water.
this is the Georges family in 1933. Back row is Louis, who's 13, George, William, who's 14. Middle row is Helen, Sadie, the matriarch of the family, Georgia, Christos, who's 46, is holding their youngest, Nicholas, who's about 6 months old in this photo. Constant is 12. In the front row is Earl, James, and Aphrodite. My grandfather disappeared one day, and he went into his front room, the parlor, and he sat down after having thought about his life and the relationship that he had with his brothers, his George's brothers. And reflecting on those, he wanted to ensure that his family were raised on the straight and narrow. So he wanted to put his words and thoughts down on paper, and then he indicated to his family that they should read this every day, and this was to build their characters throughout their lifetime. Okay, these are the Georges family commandments as written by my grandfather, Christos Georges. They were to read these rules every day of their lives and to use as a guideline. Avoid company with bad girls and boys and save your health and your life. Avoid smoking. Avoid playing the stocks. Look far ahead for success. Always think for tomorrow. Avoid gambling and drinking alcoholic beverages. It is your life's destruction. Money can't buy your character. If you lose your character, you are lost. Always go straight. Preserve your character. Prosperity and success, if you can reach this top place by observing strictly this road to life. This means you. This is your profit. Love your home and your family. Never swear. Love your neighbors. And don't take anything that is not yours. By doing this faithfully, you will enjoy the fruits of your health. This was home. They made it home. They didn't know what they were coming to. My grandfather was a very proud businessman, father, husband, grandfather.
There was a vibrant Greek community, and now we're very few families. The pride is there. It's part of who we are. But I say the word Greek Canadian. I'm a proud Greek Canadian. So the Greeks have contributed in different areas too, and families who have left their stamp. I think their work ethic, is something incredible.
I want to thank my grandfather for having the vision to come to Canada to get educated. You come to Canada as a young kid in sandals, and here I am today enjoying my family, being able to do what I want to do. It was all through hard work, but that's what we were taught.
At one time, I would say during the 50s, there were at least a minimum of 100 Greeks in Owen Sound. Now we're lucky, I would say maybe if there's 30. My grandparents would be proud. At a family reunion, my grandfather would look around at all of his family and hold his wife's hand and say, "Look at what we created."